The next topic is the periosteum and the endosteum. So the periosteum is the fibrous connective tissue layer on the outside of the bone, and the endosteum is the layer on the inside of the bone. On the outside with the periosteum, you do have the fibrous layer and then the cellular layer. And what you have are what's known as perforating fibers that come from the periosteum into the bone, into the osteons of the bone. And then those same fibers, which are going to be collagen-based, are going to be the same fibers then that are going to attach to the tissue around, and specifically to the tendon of the muscle. So you have these collagen fibers that are organized in a much more parallel fashion than the collagen fibers found in bone. And so that parallel fashion then is going to be able to be synonymous with the dense connective tissue that will become tendons. The periosteum covers the entire bone except for at the joint capsule. So at the ends, you could say, where the bones are going to come together to form joints. With that, you have the capacity for osteoblasts, and then you have the capacity for specialized bone cells to create bone on the outside of the long bone. Functions of the periosteum are to isolate it, to provide roots for circulation, nerve, and then in the fact that you do have osteoblasts, osteoclasts, to participate in bone repair, so monitoring the bone from the outermost aspect of it. And also on the endosteum, you have the same thing, where you have osteoblasts that can, osteoblasts and osteoclasts that can erode the inside of the medullary cavity, and this is how the bone grows in what's known as oppositional growth, which we talk about in 1 second. The endosteum, so inside, is an incomplete layer. It doesn't have the fibrous aspect to it. It does have the cellular aspect to it, and that's what I was talking about with it being incomplete. Endosteum will cover the entire trabecula of spongy bone, so those kind of projections of spongy bone. And inside the medullary cavity, or the central canals, what you have are the builder cells, osteoblast, the stem cells, osteoprogenitor cells, osteoprogenitor cells, and then osteoclasts. So that you have everything, one-stop shopping for everything the bone needs to put down more bone and also to erode the bone. Just some fun facts, I guess, or not so fun facts. Bones grow, certain parts of the bones grow until you're about 25, and then after that, no more growth but maintenance. This concept of osteogenesis is the process of bone formation, and it happens in a activity called ossification. Most of this, I've used these terms already many times already. There are two main types of ossification. There's endochondral membranous ossification, and then intramembranous ossification. Let me say that again. I think I said it. So endochondral ossification and intramembranous ossification, which is otherwise known, intramembranous ossification is otherwise known as dermal ossification. And we'll talk about those two in the slides coming up. Calcification is the process of putting calcium salts down, and so a couple of these we've talked about. It's interesting about the bone age. You actually, what they're talking about, they grow. Some of your bones grow till you're 25. Not all of your bones are growing until you're 25. So you have the closing of those epiphyseal lines. But don't get scared. That doesn't mean your bones then start dying. You do start losing bone density, but your bone always, unless you have some sort of disease process, or you have a nutrition issue, or you have a healing issue, your bones are constantly able to repair themselves. So enchondral ossification. This is the most common type of bone formation in the body. What you have is several steps in enchondral ossification. You have a piece of hyaline cartilage. It's one of your more substantial cartilages you have, and it is formed in kind of the shape of the bone, what the bone is going to be. So you have that on the far left here, just the bluish. And what happens is some of those chondrocytes, those are the cells of the cartilage, enlarge, and in that enlarging, then there's some calcium matrix that actually forms around them. They enlarge and then they die. And so you have some calcium matrix with some open spaces, and this happens basically in the middle of that hyaline cartilage. We happen to call that the ossification center. Then what happens is on the outer portion of this hyaline cartilage, you have blood flow. You have a vessel come to it. And when that vessel comes through it, now you have oxygen coming, you have nutrients coming, so the whole process kind of speeds up quite a bit after that step takes place. You have osteoblasts. So when the blood comes to the area, you have blood bringing fibroblasts that give rise to osteoblasts, and osteoblasts build. We know that, and so that they will put down a narrow layer on the outside of this bone, of this hyaline cartilage, of bone tissue. Then what will happen is the blood vessel will move to the ossification center, to the middle of this hyaline cartilage. We're on step 3. And again, the bringing of nutrients, etc., will accelerate this process of bone building inside. And then and the first thing that is designed in this kind of ossification is spongy bone. So you have these trabeculae created on the inside of this hyaline cartilage. That continues until the entire diaphysis has been created in spongy bone. Then of course that will be remodeled into compact and then a medullary cavity, etc. But at the ends of this hyaline cartilage, you still have cartilage, and then what you'll have then is ossification centers in each of those proximal and distal epiphysis. But you still have that metaphysis line, that middle line between the diaphysis and the epiphysis, and that will continually have these enlarged chondrocytes to the point that on one end, on the diaphysis line, you have bone being created. On the epiphysis line, you have the chondrocytes being the chondrocytes will be reproducing. So what this does, this line, this epiphyseal line, allows this bone to grow in length. So you have a process here that allows the bone to grow in diameter, and for the middle to be hollowed out, which turns into the medullary cavity, and also for the bone to grow in length because of this epiphyseal line. And this is pretty much how most of your bones are developed in this kind of ossification. The second kind, the intramembranous ossification, also called dermal, because it develops in the dermis. We've talked about the dermis already, and what happens is you have osteoblasts that come out of mesenchymal cells. And this occurs in what's genetically predetermined as ossification centers. You have blood already in the area, and the osteoblasts build a matrix around themselves. As that matrix builds around themselves, then you're building into these spongy bone spicula, or the trabeculae, or the projections that make up spongy bone, and that grows into the shape that the whole arrangement started out. It started out as a predetermined shape it's going to be. What happens then, because when we think of the, say, the jaw, or we think of the clavicle, where these bones have occurred, they don't start out quite the shape they are as the adult. So there is quite a bit of remodeling that happens after the initial bone has been established. And you can see that on the infant skull that we have all the way to the left, where you do have a mandible that kind of looks like what the adult jaw looks like, but not quite. And so you have a basic design of what the bone's going to look like with the intermembranous ossification, with this whole process, and then it will be remodeled and not redesign, but add to the design to create the adult bone that we all associate with that particular shape. And then the last thing that happens is the spongy bone gets remodeled into a layer of compact bone. So you have the periosteum, you have compact bone, you have spongy bone. It's like the spongy bone sandwich. It's that diplo arrangement where you have compact bone, which we call the cortical bone here, and then the periosteum and spongy bone in the middle, with a certain amount of red bone marrow interspersed among the trabeculae of the spongy bone. And that's intermembranous ossification. The other one's enchondral ossification. Those are the two types of development of bone that take place in the human body. I talked a little bit about appositional growth already. After the bone is established and grows in length, you still have this ability to thicken and strengthen, and that's because you have cells that are eroding away inside the medullary cavity and adding to the underneath it, the cellular layer of the periosteum. So you have this bone able to grow in diameter because of this type of growth. These are just kind of cleanup type concepts. These epiphyseal lines, as I talked about, these are the lines that will show up on X-ray. You can see that here, where you have the space between the diaphysis and the epiphysis, and this would be the line that, until this individual became mature enough, say 25, since that's what we mentioned, this would have still had cartilaginous, would still have those chondrocytes. After the age of 25, for this individual, just for example, this no longer has any chondrocytes in it. But there is a line there that showed where they were. As the long bone matures, osteoclasts enlarge the medullary cavity. I think I already talked about that. And then with regard to how this can be living tissue, you have an artery and vein that is going to feed, and many times it's multiple, but a lot of times it's going to be one artery and vein that's going to feed that particular bone, and though they will be interspersed amongst the entire bone. So it's not just on the outside, and be interspersed amongst the entire bone in terms of nutrient development and a delivery to that bone. And also the lymphatic vessels. We'll pick this up next time.